Well, we're in the clock shop right now. This is the shop that restores vintage antique clocks. Just across the hallway is the antique radio shop, where I do all of my vintage radio restoration as well as vintage electronic restoration. I've been working on clocks, I would guess, probably for the last 55 or 56 years. I think I took my first clock apart when I was about 5 or 6, and then it just took off from there. When I went to college, I did a lot of work on clocks for students' parents. I spent probably more time in the dorm room working on clocks than I did going to class. I really didn't have much interest in college. And that's kind of what got me into electronics, because in 1973 I went to Brown Institute of Broadcasting to become a disc jockey. Saw Clint Eastwood play Misty for me, and I guess it all took off from there. Now anyway, I did a little college radio, and what really became interested in broadcasting. Well, in 73 I obtained my first class radio telephone license. And in those days, to work on a transmitter, you had to have the first. Today you don't, and it's too bad, because there are still a great many people in broadcasting and out of broadcasting who busted butt to get that license. The second is particularly difficult because it's basically all theory. And I had an instructor at Brown who wanted us to learn the theory behind the FCC questions. And that is what got me into electronics. I spent 13 years in radio as a disc jockey, in programming, music director. I was assistant chief engineer at a number of radio stations, and also a transmitter engineer and studio engineer at another station. So I have a pretty good background in electronics. I also did some work for a radio TV repair shop, had a radio TV repair shop of my own back in the 70s, and was a QC tech for a major electronics corporation. I opened my clock repair shop in 1989, and a number of years later decided to put on the other hat, vintage electronics, and open my shop for repairing basically antique radios, amplifiers, and phonographs, and some test equipment too. As far as clocks go, there are very few people doing it anymore, which is all the better for me. A lot of people don't go into it because they don't think there's any money in it. Well, that's all that much more money for me and a few others who do this as our living or as a supplement to our living. As far as vintage electronics go, around these parts, there's nobody that will touch. Let's say a Zenith 6510 radio, they send that stuff out to me. They either don't have the time, don't have the interest in doing it, probably do not have the knowledge to do it. Most of my business, I would say actually about half of my business, comes off of my website. The other half is divided between word of mouth and some local advertising. Looking at a clock this morning from a 1954 Chevrolet Bel Air. Now, this clock came in to me via word of mouth. The customer has a number of antique cars, and he wanted to get this car ready for show and for driving. And we've had a really rough winter here in the north woods of Wisconsin. Had a heat wave the other day, got up to a whole 50 degrees, so he decided to get his 54 Chevrolet out, and noticed the clock wasn't running, so immediately he brought it to me. Chevrolet clocks were wind-up clocks between 51 and 54, and the only exception was the Corvette. That was an electric clock. Kind of strange, because prior to 1951, Chevrolet clocks, like most General Motors, in fact, like all other General Motors clocks, were wind-up. Were electric. As a matter of fact, I don't think there was any car clock manufactured after 1931, or certainly after the mid-1930s, that was a wind-up. But there was a run of Chevrolet clocks, 51 to 54, that were wind-up, and they virtually had the same movement. This is a movement out of a New Haven Watch and Clock Company factory New Haven, Connecticut. Well, obviously we're looking at the front, so I'm going to turn the clock around. Hopefully it won't fall out of this little stand. And you'll get a pretty good look at the back of the clock. And we'll start right here. This great winding gear here winds the mechanism. This is on the back of the mainspring barrel, which you can probably see there, the brass with the shine on it. When I remove this great wheel, take this clip off and remove the wheel, I can actually take the mainspring out of the barrel, stretch it, and lubricate it. When this clock came into the shop, it was wound up too tight. Customers said that's why it's not running. Well, it's not why it wasn't running. There was a screw, and I reinserted it in the dial that had vibrated out and was caught in the works. And when I removed that screw, the clock started to run, but not run well. So then I took some oil, a proper oil, and lubricated the ends of the shafts, the pivot ends of the shafts. I chuckled a little bit there because people will bring clocks in that have been sprayed with WD-40, some kind of a silicone spray, and also liquid wrench in an effort to get the clock to run. That is not what you use. You use a proper oil that has actually a fish oil derivative in it. That works quite nicely and lasts for a long time. Right here, where I'm pointing, is the end of the front shaft of the clock. And on that shaft, difficult to see, but toward the back, is a pinion that engages with this pinion right here, which winds the great wheel, turns the great wheel, and winds the clock. The great wheel is held in place by this click dog, and the click dog has a spring, a return spring on it. If that spring breaks or becomes stretched, the great wheel will spin around to the left. And if the clock is fully wound, it will spin around with a great deal of violence and perhaps damage the movement. I'm going to try to give you a demonstration and make it a little easier for you to understand this, how it works, by doing a little bit of a winding here. See that? And how nicely that click dog holds the great wheel. Good strong spring there, and that's what we like. There's a little more gearing on the back of the clock as well, beginning here. This arbor here on the front runs all the way back. There's a pinion on the rear of that arbor that engages with a pinion just below it. And that's got a pinion on it that engages with the this little piece here that looks like about a quarter of a gear. That's the regulator. And on the regulator is a piece with a hole in it, and the hairspring on the balance wheel passes through that hole. If the regulator is over too far away from the hairspring stud, the clock will run fast. If the proximity is too close to the hairspring stud, the clock will run slow. And you try to find the happy medium where the clock keeps fairly accurate time. This movement is a one-day movement. It means it'll run probably about 30 hours on one winding, but each day when the driver got into the car, he was supposed to wind the clock. Most people forgot to do that, so the clock just sat, and the lubricants got hard, and the clock eventually would not run. Nice little motion here is the balance wheel, and if you look down right about here where I'm pointing, you'll see a gear moving. That's coming right off of the pinion on the hand shaft, which is driving a toothy gear that is the escape wheel. I don't know if you can see it. Well, I'll explain to you. The escape wheel operates a lever. There are two pins on the lever, and the escape wheel operates those two pins back and forth. The lever goes back and forth. The end of the lever has a tongue. It looks like the forked tongue of a snake that engages with a stud that is fastened tight to the balance wheel. And that rocking action is what keeps the balance wheel in oscillation. And of course, all of that comes right back to the power in the mainspring. It's actually a very simple clock. This particular clock was manufactured, as I believe said earlier, by the New Haven Clock and Watch Company, USA, at a time when all good things were made in the USA. And it had a production date of March 5th of 1954. Luminescent dial with a black backplate behind it. And this is the bezel, which is seen when you look at the clock as it is mounted in the dashboard. 53 and 54 Chevrolet clocks mounted the same. The dashboards were virtually, in fact, they were identical in 53 and 54 standard production Chevrolets. The exception was the Corvette. And these are the various fasteners. You have 3 slotted fasteners and 3 hexagonal small fasteners that fasten the movement to the case and the bezel onto the case of the movement. And that's about it. We'll let it sit in the stand here for a little while and run, and then reinsert it in the case, regulate it, and give it back to another happy customer. So it's another happy day here in the clock shop. Well, this is the customer's 1954 Chevrolet Bel Air car clock, completely reassembled. Looks pretty good, too, if I say so myself. And I will. Before I reassembled the clock into the case, I completely polished the bezel with a Nikon polish made by Nikon, available in all hardware stores. Taking a close look at it, you can tell that the bezel is absolutely pit-free. Maintains its original luster. Looks pretty good. If you've ever wandered through a salvage yard and you've looked at some of the car clocks in the salvage yard, radios and chrome, you'll notice that there's probably a lot of pits and a lot of it is discolored. Well, when that happens, you have to remove the bezel and you have to send it to a plater. And plating can be very expensive. The plastic lens is chip-free, it's crack-free, and all I did with that was to wash it in warm water, simply warm water, and dry with a paper towel. Lenses you have to be extremely careful of, particularly when the numbers, and these are luminescent numbers with luminescent paint, are inset into the lens. The wrong abrasive or the wrong chemical that you use to clean will wash that luminescent paint right out, and then it's a mess. The hands are also luminescent. I didn't do anything with those, nor did I do anything with the back plate. There's a green trim ring around here as well, which is color coordinated to the interior of the car. This adjustment right here is the speed adjustment for the clock, and you will remember that on the back of this shaft that runs across here was a pinion that is used to regulate the regulator. On the other end of the regulator is a little wafer with a white indicator on it. And to simply adjust the speed of the clock as you move the regulator, it moves that wafer one way or the other, slow or fast. And the idea is to keep in mind where that regulator was the next time you have to adjust it. All in all, I think the customer will be happy with it. I will leave it in the stand for a few days and just make sure it's properly regulated. And that pretty well wraps things up today here in the clock shop.